Hey there, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. May the 4th be with you. It's now been about 4 weeks since it was stated that Russia has restarted their offensive campaign, trying to restart their offensive for the spring-summer period of 2026. And we now have some results on the front line. So let's look at what's happening there. And let's just say it's not looking that great for Russia overall. I already mentioned in some of my last videos that Russia has been very active in the Sumy region, where Ukraine have not been really in control of the border that much. However, since then, Ukraine has reinforced the monitoring and response units' presence to the border, and since then there has been less and less Russian, I don't want to say activity, because activity is there, but any kind of longer-term presence on Ukrainian territory has now been cut significantly. There have been some fighting around the north of Vovchansk, but despite all of this, in the last couple of weeks, there was no breakthroughs or new territory exchanges really reported. Around Kupansk, so this is where I actually missed a specific point. Now, if you have followed my reports, I explained you a lot the complications around Kupansk. I explained that there is this Russian grouping where they crossed this little bit of a river or a stream that goes right over here. And I explained to a lot of people that Ukrainian defenders that are located on the right side of the river here, they are actually safe while Ukrainian gateway town was still secured. That gateway town was Sinkivka, and unfortunately I missed on reporting on this, but yes, Sinkivka over the last, I believe it was month and a half ago, it was actually overrun and taken. Russians since then were able to move along the river in this area. That is why, for example, there is still some reinforcements making it to Kupiansk right now, as Russians are able sort of to still sip into the city right now. And this is specifically because Ukrainians have lost control of the Sinkivka gateway or a fortress town. There is a very fascinating situation developing in Leman, but it's a very slow burn sort of a situation because this has been going on for a while. So Russians here, they want to reach the town of Leman, which is a key point for Russia in their summer campaign. And to do that, they have been moving towards the west, and they have been moving also right over here. Now, Ukrainians are trying to undermine Russian advances, and they have launched counteroffensive actions towards Zarychne to prevent Russian advances, and also towards the main forces of Russia. And more importantly, they are trying to move to kind of undercut the Russians that have this salient over here. This was combined together with the Ukrainian sort of a breakthrough towards Yampil, where they resupplied some of their forward positions. And with additional forces, the hope was that they would be able to undercut the Russian offensive. Yet Russians responded to this by attacking Ukrainians and trying to undercut Ukrainians by both trying to put efforts in this direction, but also to send in more forces into this salient pocket to try to essentially encircle the Yampil situation. So right now, what is happening there is this slow burn of operations where Ukrainians are trying to one-up Russians, Russians are trying to one-up Ukrainians. Interesting situation is around Chasiv Yar. You remember Chasiv Yar, basically the next town after Bakhmut? Yes, that Bakhmut from the start of the war. Literally, this is all that Russia was able to make it. And Russian Z propagandists and war correspondents are crying, stating that Ukrainians have counterattacked in Chasiv Yar and they had major success, regaining some of the important positions around parts of Chasiv Yar, that town that is next one right after Bakhmut. And while Russians are trying to attack Konstantinivka, their efforts there have pretty much stalled. Now, if you don't know what Konstantinivka looks like right now, so here's an image of that for you. Yeah, it's pretty devastated. Yet, despite all of that, Russians that are entering that town, they're having major trouble advancing, and Ukrainians are putting up a pretty decent fight. Area beyond Pokrovsk-Mirnograd is intensely contested by Russians as they're trying to push both north of Pokrovsk-Mirnograd, also right above it, and more importantly also towards Grishina, where their main efforts are located. However, Ukrainians have conducted, with reports, some successful operations around Novoalexandrivka. Ukrainians are also trying to fight for Rodinske, that Russians have reported taking, I believe, already like 4 times or something. And Ukrainians are trying to build like a solid defense line here around the northern area as well. The only notable thing what was happening in the south was the situation around Stepnohirsk and Primorske. So here, Russian Z propagandists, despite the fact that this is not being really demonstrated on the map, you see, it's still colored by the deep state, the map creators, as being gray area. Russians are actually stating that Ukrainians have conducted pretty successful operations, pretty much liberating Primorske, and also making significant gains in Stepnohirsk, essentially removing Russian ability to move towards the north, towards the big town of Zaporizhia. After Russians crossed this specific body of water, it was expected that after this, Russians will be able to significantly increase their tempo of advances, yet it didn't happen, and now Ukrainians are also successfully counterattacking, if you can judge by the liters of tears that Russian Z bloggers are shedding. And that's about what was happening in the last 2 or so weeks. And you might say, Georgie, that doesn't sound like a lot. You would be absolutely right. Remember when I started, I said that it was the 4th week since Russia restarted a lot of their offensive operations, and that April is going to be defining how bad it is for Russia? It's bad. It's really freaking bad. Latest week is showing that they were able to capture only 3 square kilometers per day. To put it into perspective, last year, Russian tempo at their peak of advances, when a lot of the Western media have been telling that, you know, Russia is gonna completely roll over Ukraine, and me on this channel explaining that no, it's not a very fast tempo of advances anyway. It's gonna take Russia maybe 4 to 5 years to capture the rest of Donbas, best case scenario. At that time, the Russian tempo of advances was 20 square kilometers per day. That was then. Now, well, if you put all of these together, I believe it's like 4.3 or something per day. This is basically 5 times slower tempo than whatever slow tempo Russia already had last year, when they captured over the whole year less than 1% of the Ukrainian territory. This year, 5 times slower. They are standing still. Russia is going absolutely nowhere, except on the paper they're saying, well, we have like a plus sign in our territory this week. I also want to cover a couple of news that are making Russian Z propagandists cry, and we're going to kind of escalate the crying amount as we go along. The first one was that Russians one-sidedly announced the ceasefire for the 8th and 9th of May to celebrate their Victory Day parade and so on, stating that if this will not happen, then Russia is definitely gonna bomb Kyiv. Well, obviously they're stating here that they have refrained from doing so. This is not true. We have a lot of documental evidence. That's not the point. What is important is that Z propagandists are crying why it has not been done before. If there is an ability essentially to strike a Kyiv center, why this has not been done before to help Russia win the war against Ukraine. The reality is obviously Russia is trying to strike everything in Ukraine non-stop. It's just that Ukraine is preventing a lot of these activities. Russia does not have the tool. They are telling you that they have. They are engaging in their propaganda machine to show that on paper they're advancing, on paper they can strike the Kyiv center, but reality is they are nothing. They have really failed in this one. But I also want to point your attention to a very interesting situation that was created by the Zelensky diplomacy team that is now also blowing up Russian backhands. So you see here, Russians have announced one-sidedly, sort of putting like this, like a chicken playing with Kyiv, stating there's like, do the ceasefire that we have announced. So if Kyiv accepts the ceasefire, then Russians are winning and stating, yes, we convinced Kyiv to take our terms. Well, President Zelensky actually is not against the ceasefire. Now, there's different opinions on this, but generally speaking, President Zelensky just wants this war to end. And Ukrainians don't want this war, period. They just want Russians out of their land. But their diplomacy team has made a very interesting move. So Ukraine announced an armistice starting on May 6th. Well, this is not May 8th that was announced by Russia. So what they have done basically is now, well, Russia, you're stating that you're going to start from May 8th. Well, we're starting it from May 6th. So now it's going to be ball in the Russian court. If they break this armistice for starting May 6th, then Zelensky is in a full right to then get drones going to the Russian 9th of May victory parade, whatever is left of it. If they will accept it, then suddenly they're caving in to Ukrainian terms. Escalating the amount of cries and rage of the Russian propagandists is this picture right over here. Overnight, a Ukrainian FP2 drone has flown into Moscow. It passed 3 layers of intense Russian air defense, and it struck a high-rise building that was only 6 kilometers away from Kremlin. This is not the start of the war when there was some first drones flying to Moscow. We're talking about one of the most fortified and air defense dense cities and objects inside of Russia. I believe the only thing that is more protected than Moscow itself is Putin's residence. Yet now we saw that despite all of that, despite the insane amounts of air defense and additional security measures that have already been rolled out, Ukrainian drone just went through all of this and hit the heart of Moscow. The symbolic gesture here is an absolutely cherry on top. But the absolute rage and non-stop anger management issues from the Z propagandists is the Yerevan Democracy Summit, where the leaders of democratic countries, European democratic countries and Canada came in to discuss the democracy in Europe. And also President Zelensky was there. But the key point here is where it was happening. It was happening in Yerevan. Yerevan is part of the Eurasian Economic Union, sort of like EU for Russia and their satellite states. Yerevan is Armenia, which is also part of ODKB, sort of a Russian NATO. Yerevan has been seen by the world and a lot of people inside of Russia as sort of a Russian proxy. There is a Russian military base inside of that country. Yet, despite all of that, there was President Zelensky that arrived, waltzed in, just participated in this summit, really nicely spoke with all of the leaders. I will cover it in a separate video. But this absolutely enraged Russians. They have been slamming Armenia non-stop after this. and it is hilarious. But the most important, I think, is summarized here by my Roland GX3P. Thank you so much for pointing it out, my friend. Is that now with US gone, Putin has completely lost Europe. Putin has really lost in Europe altogether. That now, despite his bet on Trump, that Trump is just going to come in and he's going to make deals and he's going to make things happen that will favor Russia, the reality is that Trump, by alienating Europe, he pushed a lot of Europe together. And with Orban gone, now European outlook looks pretty much devastating for Putin. There is now nobody there that is ready to give essentially shill out for Putin 24/7. Right now, Europe is bunching up together. They are finding more and more ways to support Ukraine and more militarizing to resist any kind of scenario coming from Russia. It's unfortunate, obviously, that US is now gone off the European agenda, but on the other hand, it does create for a stronger Europe, which I am all for. We often talk about Russian propaganda, and sometimes because I read through it every day, so for me what Russian propaganda is obvious. Yet I do feel not always it makes its way to the English-speaking media. That's why I want to stop here for a second and show you an example of the Russian propaganda. This is what being fed to the Russians and the Ukrainians on the Russian-occupied territories. So just listen this. It's better to just hear it because you will not believe me otherwise.
A young girl, only 4 years of age, has been nailed to a fence, and she was set in that stretched out position. And on the opposite side of that same fence, her little brother, just 2 years old, has been crucified and nailed there as well. And for what reason? What was the purpose of it all? According to what the local people recounted later on, their mother was the wife of a local militiaman. And you know, there are plenty of those hidden collaborators living there. So initially, a group of 20 men beat her, they abused her, they brutalized her, then they tied her hands and feet to armored personnel carriers and tore her body apart right there in the square.
I cannot find any difference from the German Nazi propaganda, to be honest, coming from this one. This is what Ukraine is fighting against. Russia is shoving down just incredible amounts of these messages down the Russian throats. And they are eating it up and scooping this up. Because while this propaganda is on TV, there's going to be people, real people in real life, that with full seriousness are going to start explaining to the Western audience, stating like, you know, Ukrainians were always Nazis. And then they did X, Y, and Z. And this all stems from stuff like this. How is this different from the Thousand Hills radio? And to finish on a positive note, I want to present you with the first Russian submarine that has verified cope cage. There is now Russian submarines that have cope cages installed on them against Ukrainian drones. The day has come. We are here. Cope cages on submarines. Thank you so much for watching this video. Continue supporting Ukraine on our fundraiser. Your help is very needed. Trust in Ukraine. Support Ukrainian armed forces. I love you. Slava Ukraini. And I will see you next time.
I see you